So up next, we have a panel on transformational leadership in a multipolar world, moderated by CHL Director Mariana McGlasson, who will soon introduce her panelists. And following the panels, Kim Scriven, CEO of the H2H Network, will facilitate a Q&A, where you will have the chance to address questions both about the panel and Dr. Tamam's keynote. Mariana, take it away.
Could I please invite the panelists to just join me on stage while I introduce you? I am already so energized by the conversations I'm hearing, the people I'm meeting, and the energy in this room, and the energy online, to all of you online who are waiting patiently for us to move from session to session, and for all of the engaging questions that we're seeing online. Please, you can come sit. We've got these nice, comfortable chairs up here. No one wants to see me on stage. So we decided over conversations in the past few weeks to have a conversation today about what I believe is a fact, and it's perfect timing after Dr. Tamam's keynote. We spend a lot of time for really decades talking about a future reality of a multipolar world. But what we are living through right now is a fundamental shift in the global world order, with the U.S. abdicating its global leadership position that it's held for about 80 years. For better or for worse, that has changed. But where I see hope, and what gets me excited, not to diminish the suffering that has been caused by the funding crisis, not to diminish the quite literally tens upon tens upon tens of thousands of jobs that were lost, and certainly not to diminish the immediate, real, tangible suffering that happened at the community level, people not being able to get their medicine or their food or their shelter from one day to the next. But within that, I think there is cause for hope for those of us who have been talking about systems change. And I say that in air quotes because what does that really mean? It's a definition like localization that can be co-opted by anyone. In some conversations with Dr. Sisira and others on this panel over the last few weeks, there was a lot of energy around this idea of where do we see new systems rising up? Where can we find examples around the world of emerging economies, governments, social movements, and alternative ways of thinking that have actually quietly been getting on with the work of disaster response and taking care of communities adjacent to that one-size-fits-all approach for quite a while. So with that introduction, you would have seen in the agenda, we have a few key questions we are going to wrestle with today. With this change in the world order, we have entered into a multipolar world. What does this mean for humanitarianism and disaster response? What opportunities does this new era herald for new ways of working and new players to engage in this space? How can emerging economy governments enter the leadership void with a plurality of systems for response, solidarity, and regional cooperation? What does humanitarianism look like going forward, and how must it be redefined and reimagined while not losing ground in the struggle for dignity, self-determination, human rights, and protection of minorities and marginalized groups, including women? This panel is going to feature, I can quite confidently say, some of the smartest people I know. And so I will briefly introduce each of the panelists, and then I will ask a few questions of each of them. We'll try and have this more of a conversation. I've heard some murmurings from our participants that we haven't been leaving enough time for Q&A, but I will say that is a two-way street. You have to come back on time because we've eaten up our Q&A time, so that's my little scolding. We will do our best to zip through this session so that we have time for Q&A at the end, but these incredible people will be around, and I'm sure they're happy for you to corner them for another conversation. So with that, Dr. Sisira here. He is a distinguished expert in disaster risk management, climate change and adaptation, and sustainable development with over 2 decades of dedicated experience. His extensive work includes risk governance, food security, disaster preparedness, localization, post-disaster damage and assessment, and resilient recovery. He's the Director of Preparedness and Climate Action at the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center. I could read this for quite literally 6 more minutes, but I do encourage you, as with all of the panelists, it's just been a delight to get to know Dr. Sisira over the last handful of weeks. I have to pull Aihams out because my printing didn't work. So I've actually known Dr. Sukhni for a number of years, and I have huge respect for him, the way he works, and the way he leads and lives in the world. He's an expert and humanitarian leader with over 2 decades of experience, dedicated to fostering peace, stability, and effective crisis management in conflict-affected regions. He's a lawyer with dual master's degrees in demographic studies and conflict management and humanitarian action, and a PhD in international relations. He's been working with Qatar Red Crescent Society since 2010. He's got a much more interesting story than that. I'll let you ask him. But in 2020, he started working as the head of planning and studies, and in 2024, he assumed the role of head of international relations. He's a pretty big deal. So again, you will not find yourself bored if you have a conversation with my dear friend Aiham. To my right, we have 2 very interesting people, in my opinion. We'll start with Themrise. Themrise has almost 30 years of experience as an aid practitioner and researcher in her home country, Pakistan, and globally. You all may know her very well as the co-editor of a very good book called White Saviorism and International Development. I think that's a timely book for this conversation. And she's written numerous chapters and articles on global development and humanitarianism. For the last few years, she's been working very hard on constructing an alternative ecosystem for global development and humanitarianism, which focuses squarely on the global south. I think it's clear why she's on this panel. And then on this side, Gopinath Parayil, also known as Gopi. He's the founder of the Blue Yonder and co-founder of Resilient Destinations Foundation and a visiting fellow at Fordham University in New York. He's a pioneering leader. If you just listen to this, I think it's so interesting, in responsible tourism, disaster management, and social entrepreneurship, but it extends beyond tourism. And what I've learned about Gopi is he has this unique ability to understand what I think many people who identify as humanitarians miss, and that is the very interesting nexus between the tourism industry, climate crisis, and humanitarianism. For me, the first time I heard Gopi speak, it was quite a light bulb moment. So with that, you've now met our panelists, and I hope we can have a really exciting and interesting conversation. I'll start with Dr. Sisira. Your work at ADPC has been providing technical assistance, capacity building, research, and policy support across the entire Asia Pacific. Could you talk a little bit more about your organization's work and the leadership opportunities you see from your vantage point in this new multipolar world? And what do you think the shift in US leadership means for emerging economies?
Well, good afternoon. Mary, thank you for inviting us for this very exciting discussion. Before I go into the details, I was in Thailand before this Myanmar Thailand earthquake struck us, and I was IDP for 3 days. My house got affected. I had to stay outside for 3 days before I came here. And then we are also, responding to Myanmar. It's a pure polycrisis in a multipolar world. So there is no better time to discuss this subject than this particular occasion. Starting with US funding cut and the work that institutions like ADPC, Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, which is an intergovernmental organization, regional intergovernmental organization working for the Asia Pacific region. I must say that financial impact of US funding cut for ADPC is huge. 30% of our funding comes from US. But what we believe is that US is not going to be the last donor to cut funding to ADPC, specifically if we are going to depend on the global north. That's the reality, that's the fact. And on the other hand, as a regional intergovernmental organization, if you look at our membership, the founding countries, we have membership of 9 founder member countries, and then we have 25 extended member countries. On the other hand, if you look at the members of ADPC, here we have India, for example, 5th biggest world economy. And China is one of our founding member countries sitting on our board, 2nd biggest world economy. Right? I can continue the list. But wouldn't be surprised if Global North is not going to fund us, right? And why don't we look at alternative perspectives and the role of emerging or so-called emerging economies? They are no longer emerging economies. And Asia-Pacific region hosts 2/3 of the world population. How can we expect that 1/3 of the population from the global north or other part of the world continue to feed 2/3 of the world population in the Asia-Pacific region? So our argument is going to be that, yes, US and other donors from the global north has contributed substantially for our resilience building and disaster preparedness work. But the fact is that that phase is over. I think as ADPC, we have recognized that. And we need to look at how innovatively we work with our member countries, specifically as regional intergovernmental organization. And when I look at I just look at some of the economies in the region. China is number 2, Japan is number 3 or 4, in between. India is number 5, South Korea is number 4. The list continues, Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, Hong Kong. How about Middle East, right? And we tend to look and perhaps criticize the funding cut from the US, but why don't we bring our expertise and skills and our negotiation power, our convening power, to discuss with our own member countries? And we tend to talk about philanthropies in the global north. I wouldn't name it for diplomatic reasons. But equally, if you look at the 10 to 15 billionaire list in the world, there are rich people in our region as well, within the first 10. If you look at the first 10 billionaires, they're not all from the north. There are wealthy individuals in our region in that list. So why don't we discuss with them? Why we only focus on the north, right? I'm just trying to highlight, we are equally impacted like you, but there is a way forward for us to discuss with, they are no longer emerging economies. This is something that I like to highlight. The second thing that I think even since today morning, we discussed the role of philanthropies. Yes, they are contributing, but our understanding, our data suggests that they are not going to bridge the financing gap that has been created by US funding. We only talk about US, but many other countries start funding cut much before that, right? It start from Australia itself, it start from Europe. Look at what Norway does, look at what UK does, right? So we have to accept the fact that funding has been reducing for last few decades actually. Yes, we feel it now, but it is not just now, right? So my second point is that philanthropy's contribution will be supplementary, but they are not going to bridge the gap for sure. So in this context, maybe our comfort zone is that we always, like for us, it's easy for us to negotiate with US, but it would be it may not be our comfort zone to go and discuss with China or India. We may not be having that skill set. We may not be familiar with the processes, but that is the only way perhaps. So how would you hone our skill, processes, tools, negotiations, powers, engage the global powers? They are no longer, small countries per se. They are global powers, and they do have resources. But what the current system is that most of the time they have G2G, government-to-government support. Take Myanmar, for example, today. Which countries first visited first went to Myanmar for this response? China, India, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Singapore, and even Sri Lanka. I'm originally from Sri Lanka, who was bankrupt a couple of years back. But the Sri Lanka allocated $1 million. On the other hand, US only reallocated $2 million, right? So this is how the ecosystem is. And we need to accept this fact and maybe re-engage in the different processes of engaging and influencing the new powers or the new dynamics, new world that we are in, right? And how do we influence them? That currently they are focusing in Myanmar, they are focusing on search and rescue operations through G2G mechanisms. So how do we influence them to go beyond search and rescue? How do we influence them to go beyond G2G? How do we use intergovernmental mechanisms? For example, there are treaty-based intergovernmental mechanisms. I see Adelina is here, who used to be part of ASEAN and AHA Center, right? So they have a convening power. And how do we use those kind of convening power to go beyond G2G? How do we use ADPC? How do we use BIMSTEC, for example, right? And I can keep talking. I'm very passionate about this subject, but let me pause here by posing that, now some of the global organizations, again, if I don't mention name, but for political reasons or diplomatic reasons, but we have to accept the fact that agencies, those were established to provide the global leaderships, be it on climate negotiation, be it on DRR, be it on humanitarian, I think they are struggling, or they are facing challenges, to say the least. In that sense, this leadership should be or could be provided by the regional and sub-regional organization. And peer-to-peer power cannot be understated. And countries today, Myanmar might listen to ASEAN than anybody else. This is the fact. So how do we build on those mechanisms? And all these intergovernmental mechanisms have a system of engaging civil society. So how do we use that mechanisms to engage civil society, and how do we play a role? I think there is an ample example that we can build on, but let me pause here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that. We're going to sort of switch the region now, and we'll ask Dr. Aiham to, having known you for a few years and having the pleasure of getting to know a little bit about your story, I think you have a really unique perspective, having worked in lots of different contexts and places around the world, but in this region specifically. How do you see the multipolar world, and how do you think organizations such as the Qatar Red Crescent Service and other, I think, Gulf foundations and implementers, how can you redefine and reimagine humanitarian leadership and response? My view is I hear people talking a lot about Gulf donors, but I don't hear people recognizing Middle Eastern, Arab, Gulf leadership. And so maybe if you could speak to that for a bit.
Thank you, Mariana. You are always inspiring me. Well, if we are talking about the situation right now, it's opportunity. It's opportunity because it limits the monopoly of power and funding by one side. But also on the other side, this kind of complex geopolitical balances will lead to more politicization, and that also might affect principles and values. For us in the Middle East, a region full of conflicts, crises, and also resources. And yes, this is what, especially in the Gulf, people look at the Gulf as a place to collect money. Just US dollars, Qatari riyals come to collect money, international NGOs coming, especially with this kind of situation. You can ask Qatar Fund for Development how many meetings and requests from international organizations. And this is, if we talk about an experience like Qatar the Crescent, or let's call them as a regional actor. And this is very important. I would say that with the situation right now, it's opportunity for NGO like Qatar the Crescent, and also for the Gulf especially. And I think also hosting this conference in Doha in this time, I would say strategical decision, because it's the opportunity for the Gulf to benefit from this situation for the impact of the humanitarian sector. But for NGOs like Qatar the Crescent, I would say it's not only about delivery of aid. It's now about influence. And we have the resources for that. And what I can call it's, an approach like a positioned influence of a humanitarian NGOs. This approach it consists of 5 components. And with that, because we are living in very fast changing world, it's not like before that every organization have a very strong fixed strategy for 10 years and we need to limit ourselves. It's not the situation right now, especially for this kind of humanitarian NGOs. So this positioning for influence is very important. And it consists of 5 components. First one, it's culturally directed independent influence. Because if we ask this kind of NGOs to work for influence without the culture, that will be disaster. Because they will go to media, they go to political actors, because we are not institutions like ICRC, like Save the Children. No, we still have this kind of flexibility. It might be an opportunity, but also it's risk, because maybe as a request of one donor, we might change the whole policy, because it's $100 million US, and that will make a big shift for us. So this is very important to be culturally and independent influence, not only influence for influence. The second component is the structural challenge to traditional system. We don't have this approach. We used to in Arab, traditions that we respect the orders, we respect the traditions. But right now, it's time to challenge this structure and traditions. And we have, the resources, the experience, and also the time, because now there will be no more one leader for the humanitarian sector or one donor. And it's an opportunity. And also, we can see that even the role of UN, it will not be as before as a central role to guide or to lead the humanitarian action. The third component is the role of operational autonomy in a humanitarian governance. Most of our humanitarian NGOs, frankly speaking, they didn't recognize the international relations and theories, and this kind of structure is very important to understand the system, because the world is guided by these theories. So without having this independent in operations, we will be guided by money and by donor. And this is very important for NGOs to reach this impact and influence. The fourth one is the negotiated influence through strategic partnerships. It's about negotiation. Before, we just believe that negotiation is only for access, and suffer access, humanitarian access, and we need negotiation skills to do that, to get, humanitarian aid for the most vulnerable. And this is not the case. Now negotiation is a must, it's not an option. And if we want to have this kind of influence without this kind of skills and understanding, we will not be able to do that. And that's the strategical partnership is very important, because we will get legitimacy. Because if I'm, having this kind of negotiation between governments, non-state actors, local community, I will get more trust and legitimacy during this kind of negotiation. And finally is the humanitarian diplomacy as a tool to building legitimacy. Our role as a humanitarian organization, it's not only about delivery of aid. I think most importantly is to amplify the voices of most vulnerable people. And with these kind of efforts, humanitarian NGOs can get legitimacy, trust, and also fund, because we will get more trust from the local community and also from the governments. We are not able to change the system, as Dr. Tammam mentioned about the situation, without having this kind of power to influence and understanding how we can, and this is a flexible and changing, so every time for each context, each organization can position themselves with this kind of very dynamic system, and according to that, they can assess their situation and assess their capacity and reset their approach according to this. It's like planets, moving. So no more one size fit all or one fixed strategy for this kind of humanitarian NGOs. They need more flexibility and be able to change their approach according to these 5 components to reach this positioned influence, and then they can change and can, get more and better situation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball. So Themrise came onto my radar because of the work she was doing, really reimagining what a lot of us fail to do. There's a constant discussion about what's wrong with the system. And then when you reach a critical point in the conversation where everyone agrees, okay, the system is broken, the very next question you hear, usually by people who are power holders, is, but if not this system, then what? And back to Tammam's point, we're saving lives. And that becomes an excuse for a whole order of failures of the system. And we just keep perpetuating because this is better than nothing, or so we tell ourselves. I'd like Themrise to give her views on what kind of leadership you think we need in this new global order, whatever it looks like. And where do you see reasons for hope? And what models do you think we need to lean into?
Thank you very much, Mariana, and to all the panelists. Assalamu alaikum. It's an honor to be here, and this is my first ever panel, ever, anywhere, let alone on a global stage. So please forgive me if I don't, if I don't follow a particular pattern. I think, first of all, for me, the issue is we need to question the idea of leadership. I know leadership has been put up on a pedestal for a number of years as well, in the sense that we need better leaders, we need new leaders. Everybody is a leader in this room. But I think the way we interpret leadership is that we connect it directly to power. We have to disconnect the idea of leadership from power before we can move ahead. So the idea of a new system contradicts this idea of leadership in the sense that I firmly believe that we have a system that's already been in place for many years. That's not the traditional aid system or humanitarian system, but it is a country-level system, a national system. I know in my country, Pakistan, humanitarianism has been part of our psyche for decades. We know exactly what to do when there is a crisis. We know how we need to deal with it. The issue is we don't have the resources, enough resources, but we know how to deal with it. And that's because we've got a system that's been in place for decades. What the global international world order has done is suppressed this system for many, many years and not allowed it to emerge and develop. So for me, it's not about creating a new system. It's about reviving the existing systems that are buried deep, deep below the surface and now completely covered by what we call the international system of global aid and humanitarianism. So for me, it is about digging deep into our own national psyches and bringing out what we ourselves have already also suppressed. I'll use the idea of climate change as an example. So there's a lot of hue and cry about loss and damage and that the global north owes the global south millions and billions for polluting and for CO2 emissions. That's not the way we look at it in our countries, at least not in Pakistan. South Asia is one of the most polluted regions in the world. That pollution hasn't filtered down from the US or Canada or Europe. That's our pollution. That's what we have done to our own country. That's what our government and our state has done. That's what our own citizens as well do. How do we change that? How do we take responsibility for what we have also created quite a royal mess? We have India and Pakistan sitting here on the same panel in a third country. Neither of us actually can visit our own countries. We're not allowed to. We will never get visas. And we're neighbors. We share a border. How do we as a region get together and work collectively if we're not even allowed to cross borders? How do we as a national collective, I know in Pakistan we have what people call a very vibrant civil society, but it's fragmented, it's class-based, it's income-based. It's also completely controlled by the global system of aid. Aid comes in, we create a civil society to handle that aid. We suppress the civil society that is deep down and has been desperate to come out for a long time. Eventually it withers away and it disappears. How do we bring that civil society back up? For me, that's the challenge. Everybody says you need to work collectively, both internally, nationally with a country and build its systems, and you need to work with the international and global system as well. That can happen side by side. I respectfully disagree. I think we have been subservient to the international system for far too long, and we cannot work with them unless we first work with each other. Even within our own countries, there is no national cohesion to work together on something as simple as disaster relief. In Pakistan, we were inundated by devastating floods 3 years ago. 1/3 of the country was underwater. You'd think that the entire humanitarian global system would just descend on Pakistan and say, oh my God, yeah, that's where we need to be. No one came. It was an entirely self-funded exercise. And I'm not even including the government in this. The government didn't do diddly squat to save its own people from drowning. It was literally, not even first responders, it was literally the villagers who lost their lands and their homes, who were the ones saving lives and who were rebuilding. How do you capitalize on a system like that, on a process like that? For me, that is the core. That's the answer of leadership. Leadership shouldn't be about individuals. It should be about creating a system that can withstand crisis after crisis and not break down. So I think it's an existing national economy and society that does exist in every country of the world. I think the country itself is responsible for bringing up that system, for encouraging it, for funding it. And like a lot of people have said, we do have the money ourselves. For a lot of our country, it's not about being poor and not having money. It's about how those resources are allocated and how we allocate those or misallocate those resources ourselves. As a lot of people in my own country, Pakistan, say, 3% of Pakistanis pay income tax, only 3%. If even 20% of Pakistanis paid income tax, we'd have enough money to generate our own revenue, to build our own infrastructure, to build our own dams. We wouldn't have to go to the World Bank begging for money. So it's not a simple answer because I think countries have been subservient to international money for so long and the international system for so long that we believe that we don't have the capacity or the resources to do it ourselves. Changing that mindset internally is, I think, where we need to work. And that is each country to its own. So I'll end there.
I think she did a pretty good job for her first panel. Smashed it, I would say. Gopi, you've been waiting really patiently. And actually, it's an interesting, I didn't intentionally sit India and Pakistan next to each other, and I didn't intentionally actually plan for this to so naturally segue. But I think what you're talking about of each country digging deeper and going back to the roots of how disaster response and community survival has always happened before we had an international system. It's a perfect segue to a lot of Gopi's thinking. Gopi, I've had so much fun having conversations with you over the last month or two about your big idea, your big ideas. There's so many of them. Could you share a bit about how you see the future of the humanitarian system, climate crisis? And I think we've got about 8 minutes to hear you talk about, just your big idea. What do you see in terms of what the other panelists have said and how that relates to your work?
So my background is, I'm a trained disaster manager. I studied at the Royal Military College of Science in UK and did a MSc in disaster management. But instead of all my peers who moved into UN systems or humanitarian sector per se, I decided to become a tourism entrepreneur. And the reason I did that was I was just looking at the numbers. At that time, I guess the humanitarian sector was like really tiny, maybe $18 billion. Even now it is, what, $30 billion, roughly about? Yeah, okay. So, but compared to the tourism sector, which is right now, UNWTO says it is $9 trillion US. So if you look at whatever the humanitarian sector needs during a crisis, or even the whole disaster management phases, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, these are all sitting idle with us. Whether you want shelter, accommodation, whether we want to provide food and beverage with dignity, knowing exactly what the community who is going through the disasters need with respect. And then as a travel industry, we cover the whole airport to airport logistics and supply chain, the number of vehicles, the fleet that we manage. And then interesting thing is also about most of us from the tourism industry, especially travel companies, are very well trained to take care of the travelers, which means if they go out on a trek, we know how to fix a sprain, we know to give first aid, we know how to rescue people. And then not the least, the most important one I would say is that most of the travelers, say for example, I came here to Doha, and then unfortunately after say a couple of years, I hear that some disaster happened here. The first thing I'm going to do is to call the driver. I'm going to call the hotelier who hosted me or the homestay owner who provided me a meal, because I'm concerned, because I have an emotional connect to the place. And this is something that I saw as an amazing opportunity for raising funds during crisis. So just one example is this little doll. This is from 2018 flood in Kerala. So when 2018 flood in Kerala happened, I was there in my city in Kochi, and my house was like under water, 12 feet for 8 days. And earlier I would have, my team would go, we would always been repurposing tourism tools and resources to respond. Sometimes we come up with innovative initiatives which will make sure that there is resilience built in the places. We would work with the communities on circular economy so that we can increase the acreage of mangroves, so that we can have natural barriers against cyclone, etc., etc. And we never did all these things from a space of CSR. We never did it from a space of charity. It was not a philanthropic act. We were looking at it from a perspective of, this is a product development. So I am looking at it from a perspective, say, if I am keeping apart, say, $250 a week, say $1,000 a month for 6 months. This is going into the community for the volunteers to plant, volunteers to take care of the nursery, the volunteers to make sure that we start increasing the acreage of mangroves. That costs money. We are not dependent on government. We are not seeking funds from the NGO sector or the development sector. And for us to make that money back, all I need in a week is 10 travelers who would pay $30. The rest of the money is profit. So I'm also not doing charity. So this is how we kept on working. But when it happened, when the flood happened in Kerala, we were there bang in the middle of area. Otherwise, we have responded to Asian tsunami. We were in Nepal earthquake. We worked with Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. I personally trained roughly about 4,000 volunteers sitting from like in Florence to Colorado. 18-year-old kids to, retired people who were helping the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team to map Nepal during crisis with Kathmandu Living Lab. We could sit at home and do it. And the reason we could reach out to more people was because of the network of tourism. Now, when this disaster happened in Kerala, we were probably the only group who were not surprised that the flood was there. Because since 2010, we were preparing for this flood. We were working with communities we even have a project called Climate Change Adaptability Initiative where we were focusing on the food security. So in Kerala, my home state, we have this rice called Pokali, a rice that grows in saline water. It grows up to 7 feet. This is something that the world is desperately looking for. And even with government subsidies, there is no way that the farmer is going to make money. So we intervene in that space. Instead of, say, 20 cents that they would get per kilogram, we ensured that they would get more than $1.5 per kilogram. And what we do is to reach out to hotels, restaurants, asking them to serve the rice because there is a story in it. The story of that rice that came from the mountain in 1341, Great Flood, that kind of defined the geography of the current Kerala. So this creates, interest among travelers. And then when 2018 flood happened, it did not even take 30 minutes for us to organize everything because we were planning for this. We were preparing for this for 6 years. People would laugh at us, telling like, we never had a flood in 100 years. Why do you guys want us to spend money on it? And that's exactly the reason. We haven't had a flood in 100 years, and look at what's happening around the world. Climate change is a reality, and it's soon going to hit us. And then we managed to put all our resources, and then we ended up in this tiny little village where there were 300 weavers. And they lost everything. They lost the loom, buildings, clothes, etc., and they were going to set fire to all the clothes. And then we intervened and suggested, please hold on for 24 hours, we'll come back with a solution. And the solution was this little doll. It did not even take 30 days for us to raise $132,000 US dollars, which ensured that every single weaver got back to work. And even just last week, March 31st, one of the weaving society was just going to be going through a bank foreclosure. And they needed desperately $97,000 US dollar. We negotiated with the bank and brought it down all the way to $20,000. And 10 minutes before the deadline of 10 p.m. on March 31st, we went with a check. And this is not our company money. It's from the travel industry. So this is how we've been working. So now my appeal to that humanitarian sector as well as the development sector is, yes, there's a lot of negative things happening. We are all crying for money, etc. But just think about this possibility of a partnership, a symbiotic partnership with the tourism sector. Even the tourism sector, many of my peers wouldn't even be aware of the potential of what they are sitting on. And even to the tourism sector, whenever I speak to them, I am not speaking to them telling, hey guys, let's do some CSR work, let's get some 2% tax deduction, etc. No, that's not the talk that we are. I'm always talking to them in the sense of like, we have reached a stage that earlier it was like climate change was happening somewhere out there. Now it's happening in my village. And it's the case with most of the tourism destinations globally. Because tourism, fortunately or unfortunately, happens in the most beautiful places. It's by the river, it's near the sea, it's there up in the mountain, which is all equally vulnerable to disasters. So if the tourism industry is not investing in destinations, they are only digging their own grave. So this is not a charity. So tourism industry has to help co-create climate resilient destinations. They have to equally invest in creating climate responsible destination. So just one small example, like in the city where I live, Kochi, if you look at it from the public-private partnership space or even from the public space, Kochi International Airport is the world's first 100% solar-powered airport. 100% solar-powered, like 15, 20 years ago. Kochi Metro Rail Network is already running on 65% renewable energy. And we have Kochi Water Metro running on 100% electricity, which is again coming from renewable energy sources. So that is the responsibility of destination that is there, and just imagine if we all hold hands together. So we are looking at Kochi as a live lab, and the reason I'm here when I started talking to Mariana is like, isn't it possible for us to look at another live lab elsewhere, maybe in the Caribbean, maybe in Fiji? If this model could be replicated, this dependency that we are having on the aid sector, and always complaining that Trump is bad, somebody else is bad, let it go, let them do whatever they want. But there are so many things that we can do. And we need to start looking inwards.
Tamam, could we have you up on the stage, Tamam? So we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. I would have liked it to have been 20. So here's your last scolding of the session. We'll have Kem moderate the Q&A, and then Dana will give us our instructions for the next step. So I'll pass over to Kim. And questions can come from the audience or the online and to the keynote or any of the panelists.
Hi everyone, hopefully you know the routine from this morning, so we can hear from as many as possible. Please remember to introduce yourself, do ask a question, and be as brief as possible. I see a hand already up here, so please, I think there's a microphone coming from behind.
My name is Reza from Bangladesh. Since morning, I'm following speeches from the panel members and others. I have questions in my mind. Maybe it's a devil questions. We are talking about the nexus, which has initiated by Antonio Guterres and his team: sustainable development, peace, and humanitarian. But I have a feeling that in such this tripartite sector of nexus, we are depoliticalizing our humanitarian response. It is always coming in my mind that the we must have not only the philanthropic perspective, we must have the political perspective. What are the narrative, what is happening in the global north, the anti-humanitarian narrative, we have to challenge with our own politics, that humanitarian politics.
I'll take another question before we go back to the panel. Sir over there, if there's a microphone.
Hi, Kasaga James Arnett with Teach for All, originally from Uganda, which hosts 1.74 million refugees from 34 countries. As a young man, personally, I lost my family to HIV and AIDS in the early stages of the epidemic of HIV and AIDS, a survivor raised by a grandmother. As I was going through the humanitarian cycles of finding scholarships for education, I'm an educator, I landed on Gustavo Gutierrez' quote, which it's a long one, but it ends by saying that the poverty of the poor is not a call to generous relief action, but is actually a demand that we go and build a different social order. This Gustavo Gutierrez is a Latin American liberation theologist. And for this long, even working in founding Teach for Uganda and everything, I've always known that this aid system, person at the core level, I've always known it's not working. Because I've seen the suffering of children from DRC, Sudan, Eritrea in my country, that I've walked in classrooms and I see them and it goes to my soul, crashing way, because that's what I was as a survivor of HIV and AIDS. My question to you, our leaders and those who are working on this, what will this social order, a new social order, look like? And I like the gentleman from Bangladesh, it must somehow involve governments, because somehow the political leaders end up somehow messing up whatever order it was. Thank you.
So I'll return to the panel. Mariana, I'm going to turn to you first on reorganizing the social order, and Reza's question about humanitarians finding their political voice.
So ready to not hear myself anymore. I was going to suggest that Themrise maybe take the stab on the social order, because I think a lot of your work relates to that.
It is a tough one. I'll again just say everybody talks about a dying international world order, and we need a new world order. It's not about creating a new international world order, it's about creating a national world order. So I will go back to the idea that if you want social order globally, you have to have social order nationally. And that is something that we do within our borders. It is not something that we can look to somebody outside our borders to do for us. We've been looking to that for far too long, so much so that we've co-opted our own behavior to mimic that of borders elsewhere. Just a quick example, Pakistan has hosted over 4.5 million Afghan refugees since the 1980s, since the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. They're not citizens of Pakistan. They have Afghans who have been born in Pakistan and are not granted citizenship, which is a constitutional right, because they're children of refugees. What we've been doing for the last 1 year is kicking them all out forcibly and sending them back to Afghanistan now. That's not a social order we should be proud of in our country at all. How do we change that? And what is the international government then says, well, it's not our problem, it's the problem of Pakistan, let them deal with it. But when it's something that affects them, then suddenly they jump in. So again, it's us, it's our national world order. That's what we have to work to be able to have a social order that works collectively eventually.
Aiham, did you want to come in?
Yes, but Brother Reza from Bangladesh mentioned about this kind of relationship with governments, and also I'm coming from Red Cross, Red Crescent organization, what we call the principled organization, and we have this misunderstanding before about if you engage with this kind of dialogue and discussion with governments, that might affect your independence and neutrality, etc. But as I mentioned before, we cannot work without this kind of dialogue, engagement with not only governments, states, and also non-state actors. And we have seen in our region what's kind of changing happening, especially with non-state actors and their evolving role. So we need to structurally challenge this kind of traditions in our systems. Yes, we should have a good relationship with our government, but not only our government as auxiliary role, but also with other governments, the host nation, the also refugees countries, all of these, and sometimes for access. So and the humanitarian diplomacy, it's now more than ever, it's a must for that. So engagement with governments is very much needed. We need to understand how to do that. We don't have the experience before because we were focusing only in delivery aid, and we should be, according to this kind of principles. But now it's very important to increase our capacity to do that effectively. Thank you.
Thanks, Aiham. I know we're up against the clock, so I'm going to pass over back, and thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Kim, and to all of our panelists, our keynote speaker, and our moderator. Let's give them all a round of applause. Thank you. Very important conversation. Appreciate all of your contributions. Folks, you are invited into the foyer for an afternoon pick-me-up. Please mind the clock and make sure you reach your next session by 10 till 4. So 3:50 p.m. you're due in your next session so that there are no delays. Once those sessions end, please be back here by 5:20 p.m. for the closing remarks of the day. I'll see you then.